After asserting its dominance as the go-to rep saloon and family car in the 1960s, the Ford Cortina was on a roll. The Mk3 of 1970 went all new, with a longer wheelbase, different suspension that was tuned more for ride comfort, and more sound deadening, all in the aid of making the Cortina a better long-distance cruiser. All in all, over 1.3 million Mk3 Cortinas were sold, and as far as we're concerned, it was the best generation of Cortina. So what do you need to know if you're as seduced by these gorgeous looks as we are? Well, here's everything you need to know when buying a Mk3 Ford Cortina. But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So click the link below at the end of the video to enter their latest competition. We're talking about a 70s Ford here, so surprise, surprise, there's going to be a lot of places to check for rust. First of all, starting at the front of the car, the lower valance. This is quite a low point, it's a big area, and that means it's very common to get stone chips and other damage that of course can bubble through the paint. As with most parts on these cars, repair panels for the front valance are available. The front wings are a common rust spot as well. Of course, right at the front, it's tall and it's flat, and that means stone chips causing paint damage and ultimately rust are also pretty common. You then want to have a good feel all the way along this inner arch, make sure it's still sharp, make sure it's still flat, and make sure that it's still made of metal. This was well before the time of plastic wheel arch liners as well, so get up in your arches, shine a torch in there, and again knock all the way around, see if any mud or filler falls out that tells you that the inner arches could be rotten as well. Sills are another common rust spot. Run your hands all the way along it and knock on it. Make sure it still sounds like metal and it sounds solid. Repair panels for the inner and outer sills are available. The windscreen pillars, it's very common for these to start rusting as well because of water running off the roof over time and getting trapped in the corners of the windscreen, which doesn't really have much of a drain gallery in it. But of course that can extend further down the car right the way into the bulkhead, and a good sign that there could be rust waiting for you in there is the state of the scuttle panel. So again, have a good look along there. Is that all solid and smooth? Even peel over the edges of the windscreen rubber if you can, see if there's any bubbling under there, because rot around the scuttle is a good sign that you could be looking at rust in the actual bulkhead of the car as well, although of course you do want to get the bonnet up for that. Have a good look all the way down in the engine bay. Then you want to check the roof channels. Because you've got these chrome strips along here with these gutterings, it is very, very common for water to get stuck in here over time and eventually cause a bit of very difficult to repair rust. So this is an area you want to concentrate a lot of time looking at, and again, make sure it's still made out of metal. Moving around to the back of the car, you also want to be looking at the rear arches. Again, these cop the vast majority of any mud and dirt that's thrown up over here all the way around. Make sure it's smooth, and again, that it's still solid. Have a good look in these arches as well. All the road rash and dirt and gravel and what have you will get sprayed up at the bottom of the doors, and it's very common to see frilly edges on doors of these cars. As we've discovered, boot floor rot is a very real issue for Mk3s, and unfortunately, if yours has got rot in it, the repair panel is over £800 from one source that we found. Make sure there is no sign of any water ingress or any rust waiting in there for you. And again, it's not a terrible idea to replenish the boot seal like we've done on this car to make sure that it stays solid in there. While you're around the back of the car, you also want to get under it and look at the rear chassis legs and the rear cross member, because of course you do get a lot of dirt kicked up off the rear wheels under the car, and that can cause rust as well. Another common rot spot for Mk3s, which again has affected this car, is the bottom of the A-posts leading into the inner sills. Thankfully though, the carpet is in multiple pieces, so you just want to lift the front of it up, take any sound deadening out, have a good look at the floor pans as well, because they can rot, although again, repair panels are available. Have a look at those A-posts, look at those inner sills, and if there have been any repairs done to them over time, make sure they've been done to a good standard, that they're strong. You also want to check the state of the seat mounts, particularly on the driver's side, obviously, because the driver's seat is always used in a car. Those seat mounts can actually collapse, and you'll be able to tell if it has by the fact you don't feel like you're sitting quite straight in the car. You're kind of leaning off to one side. The good news with Mk3s, as I keep saying, is the amount of repair panels. It's very easy and often quite cost effective to source, but some of those repair panels are surprisingly expensive. expensive. Talking of replacement parts, the windscreen trims on early Mark IIIs are pretty much gold dust these days. You're not going to find them for any amount of money. Similarly, the chrome arch trims on the XLs and the GXLs are very, very hard to find second-hand and often very expensive. They're aluminium, which means they're fragile. Damaging them and bending them isn't uncommon. Finally, you can get replacement door seals for these cars, and as we've discovered with this one, it could be the source of some of your interior leaks. Be warned, a 50-year-old door seal will be squashed, and that means it's very easy to shut the door casually as you walk away from the car. But a brand new one is a lot thicker, a lot puffier, and very often, if you just gently shut the door, it doesn't actually latch. So if you do put fresh door seals on your car, which only costs about 35–40 quid a side, you want to make sure when you shut it, that you give it a good solid throw to make sure it's actually sealing and you are keeping water out. Some markets got properly exciting engines in a Mark III Cortina. In South Africa, you could get it with an Essex V6, and in Australia, a 4.1 litre straight six. In the UK, meanwhile, you could have a 1.3 or 1.6 litre Crossflow, like we've got here, or a 1.6 or 2 litre Pinto. Any noise from the timing gear or the timing chain is a good sign of neglect, where an owner hasn't been changing the oil as often as they should, or with the wrong grade, and you want to be asking about that. Less immediately rectifiable is bore and piston wear, which can also happen with both the Pinto and the Crossflow. Signs of that are heavy breathing from the engine, blue smoke under acceleration, and alarming amounts of oil consumption after only a short drive. If it's entirely off the dipstick after a 10-minute drive to the shop, that's a good sign your engine is due for a rebuild. On the Pinto engines, premature crankshaft wear can happen, and that's often due to a blocked oil spray bar caused by infrequent oil changes and sludge building up in the bar itself. A tapping sound from the top half of the engine is a sign of that being the case. If the incorrect coolant mixture ratio has been used on a Pinto engine, it's not uncommon to seize up the water pump, which will cause very, very quick overheating of the engine. Finally, on a Pinto, the timing intervals on those are 30,000 miles, although it's not a bad idea to lean closer to 25,000 so you know you're not right on the edge. You could get a Mark III Cortina with either a 4-speed manual or 3-speed automatic gearbox. Now the manual is a nice unit with a nice definitive shift action, but if there's an increased rumbling from the gearbox as you go faster, that's a sign of collapsed bearings in the box. A specialist can rebuild that for you. Meanwhile, if you have got a sloppy feeling gear change, it's probably the plastic ball linkage in the gearbox has collapsed over time, particularly if someone's been driving along with their hand on the gear lever. Low fluid on the automatic gearbox often causes slow, slurred gear changes, or for the car to hang in gear a bit too long. Have a look at the fluid itself. It should be pink if it's in good condition. If it's brown or black, that means it's thoroughly burnt out and the gearbox could well need a rebuild. Noisy rear wheel bearings on a Mark III are often confused for failure of the diff. To check the diff itself, you want to look at the cover, check for any signs of corrosion around it, which means it could be letting water in, and for any signs that it's leaking diff oil. But if it's all good, then it may well be the case that you just need a new rear wheel bearing. Oh, and you might have noticed that I had a key wedged in the bonnet latch here. It's quite a common issue with Fords of this era for this bonnet latch, which is kind of a bent spring that compresses onto the latch itself, to gradually open out as it gets older and as the metal fatigues. So it's not a bad practice whenever you've got the bonnet open for a prolonged period to take a key or a small flathead screwdriver, just wedge it in there to keep it compressed and make sure your bonnet doesn't pop open while you're driving, which we experienced when I took this car to Belgium. Mark III Cortina switched to a double wishbone front end setup over the struts of the Mark I and the Mark II in pursuit of better ride comfort. Unfortunately though, that setup does have its faults. A clonking from the front end of a Mark III over bumps is a sign of worn front wishbone support pins.
You'll need a whole new front subframe to rectify it. Facebook groups and Cortina forums are a good place to start, and thankfully Mark IV and Mark V Cortina subframes will also fit.
The Mark III has got 8 what's called void bushes in the rear trailing arms and the rear diff mounts. So they support both of those components and keep them damp. They are infamous for wear, and when they do wear out, driving over bumps, the car will start to feel like it's swaying from side to side at the back.
Polyurethane bushes will last pretty much indefinitely, but they are more expensive and give a harsher ride. OE-spec rubber ones meanwhile are cheaper and retain the comfort, but they will wear out surprisingly quickly, so go for whichever option suits you best.
Moving on to brakes, the Cortina Cortina has got discs at the front and drums at the back, and they're totally adequate for pulling up what isn't a particularly fast car. If they're left to stand though, they can seize up, but that's not the end of the world really. Whole new front calipers can be bought for about 50 quid or a rebuild kit for around 20 quid, and all the items like discs, pads and shoes and drums can be bought cheaply and easily. The brake master cylinder is quite common to leak and ultimately fail on Mark IIIs, and it's a surprisingly expensive component to replace. Quite a common replacement / upgrade to that master cylinder is one from a 1980s disc brake Land Rover. We haven't tried it ourselves, but apparently it goes straight on, it's a lot more reliable, and it's a lot cheaper and easier to replace if ever you do need to change it. The interior of a Mark III is a really nice place to be. It's comfortable, it's spacious and surprisingly refined on long journeys. But be warned, a lot of the parts for it are surprisingly hard to find these days and very expensive. Take for example the cloth seats. The covers for them, if you need to replace them, are almost non-existent. If you've got the tombstone style seats like you get in the higher up models, you're in for a whole nother world of financial pain. If you are buying a higher spec car with tombstones in it, make sure they're in good condition or you really will regret it. Less expensive meanwhile is replacement carpet. You can get a full replacement carpet kit for about 200 quid, and if yours is a bit tired, it will transform your Mark III's interior. Any electrical issues with the Mark III meanwhile are usually down to corrosion in the fuse box or old 1970s wiring that's either falling apart by now or it's been bodged and cut and messed around with over time. The fuel gauge can go awry on these cars and the switch for it is very expensive, so make sure it's accurate because you do not want to be running out of fuel in these cars. The ignition switches in these cars can wear smooth inside over time, so it's worth taking all the keys, making sure that only the correct keys actually fit it and will allow you to start the car, and make sure the car can't be started with the handle of a teaspoon. The tail lights on Mark IIIs can fade over time through sunlight and they are quite expensive and difficult to track down replacement ones. The square headlights that you got on later Mark IIIs, they're unique to the Mark III Cortina, they weren't shared with any other car, and they are very, very hard to track down these days. Make sure they're good before you buy because replacing them could well be a bit of a headache. Time-wise, you'd have found a Cortina on every street corner, but thanks to rust, the ravages of time and banger racers, that very much isn't the case. These aren't street furniture anymore. If you do want to buy one though, projects tend to start at around 1,500 quid to £2,000, but be warned, for that money you are going to be needing a lot of time with the welder. If you want a roadworthy, usable car that you can improve as you go, you want to budget from £6,000 to £7,000 upwards, but do bear in mind higher up trim levels like your XLs and your GXLs can command as much as 20 or 30% premium over an equivalent condition L, for example. Meanwhile, if you want the best of the best with the Mark IIIs, the concourse winning cars that you can take to a show, you can budget £15,000 upwards for those cars. We've seen some immaculate low mileage Mark IIIs change hands at auctions for over 20 grand in the past. One potential option, if you fancy something a little bit different and potentially a bit cheaper, is a South African import Mark III, like we've got here. They got the Mark III in South Africa until late 1977, and that means you can get one like this on an R plate. As ever, when you're buying an imported car though, you want to make sure that all the paperwork's been done, that the car is in the country legally, and as we've proven, a dry, hot South African climate does not mean rust-free. Do all the same checks for rot that you would on a UK car, and just because it might look nice on the top, doesn't mean it might not be concealing a little bit of the brown stuff. There are also certain parts that are bespoke to the South African cars, like the higher-rise bonnet and the different shape heater box, that you will need to bear in mind if you need to replace those parts. But whichever one you buy, in whatever spec, whatever trim, the Mark III Cortina is a lovely classic car to use these days. It's still completely practical, it's great fun to drive. As we've proven, you can take it on a long road trip and have a great time with them, and it will get looks and thumbs up wherever you go. As far as Cortinas are concerned, I reckon it was third time luckiest.
This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link below to enter their latest competition.